pretty much who normally shows up. If you came in late, again, be sure to sign in. What I want to do with Module 5 is something a little different, all right? And what I want to do, there are 5 different topics there, okay? I want groups of you to lead us through those topics, okay? I mean, you each have a little, there's obviously an assigned article for each one of those, but I want to hear more from you in Module 5. So what I'd like you to do, as soon as you feel like doing it, and it's going to be first come, first served, is I want you to send me an email, okay? And the email is in the syllabus. There are actually 4 or 5 of you who haven't even read the syllabus, but that's okay, because I understand. I totally said it's more important to look at the Moodle page. I'm not making fun. It's just, it's kind of, it's a new school thing, all right? What I'd like you to do is send me an email and say, okay, of those 5 topics, here's the one I'd most like to talk about in class and be responsible for helping to lead a discussion in, okay? Here's my second option. Here's my third option, okay? And then I'm going to try to put you there. Let's see. We have right now, well, let's see. We have, I think, 16 people, right? So we're going to have like 3 or 4 to a group, probably, because this is usually the number of people who show up. There aren't too many people who are not here who normally show up. Does that make sense? So send me an email and say, okay, for example, what I'd really like to do most is terrorism. And then, but if I couldn't do that, then I would do globalism and gender equality, or like globalization and culture and pop culture. And that would be my third option. All right. And let me know, because I want to at least get people their second option. Okay. But this is a chance for you to show a little initiative, you know, the good old American patriotic initiative, and say, I'm going to take on the responsibility to, you know, become an expert in one of these 5 things. Here's the nice thing about it. Your assignment for that last module is only going to involve the thing you present on. Okay, nothing else. I get the sense, I don't know if people are burning out, but there is something weird about this term that seems to be wearing on people. And I think it's a combination of things, which we can talk about another time. And I don't want to be a downer or anything any more than I naturally am. But what I'd rather have you do for Module 5 is take one thing and really focus on it, and really just say, okay, if I don't look at these other readings, and it's your option to do that or not, all right, I'm really going to know the reading that I'm taking on. So if I'm doing terrorism, you know, global or local, for example, sorry, my internet's, you know, moving real slow. Okay, there's this thing called Cipher Brief, and never mind, you know, is it opinion or not? Okay, I try to get things that are not like just harebrained, but some of them they involve some commentary or analysis from a perspective or point of view. Okay, the reason why I'm telling you that is, you should never, as a responsible student scholar, just take as a given what any of these articles say. Remember, this is always someone's vantage point. It isn't the same thing as saying all scholarship is biased, therefore no scholarship is valid. That's not what I'm saying. And that's nonsense, by the way. Okay. The idea is that sometimes it's interesting, as we're going to see when we look at these different theories, you know, today, sometimes it's interesting to see something described or experience the description of something from a specific point of view, where you think, okay, this is someone who's a neoconservative realist who's going to analyze, you know, the situation in the Middle East, all right? Someone who's an idealist or someone who has another point of view might come along and explain it very differently. The same thing holds true with phenomena like terrorism, right? If you hear our so-called leadership right now, you would think that there are just barbarians at the gates right now. There are these massed groups of terrorist cells out there waiting to plunder the United States. Nothing at all could be further from the truth. Nothing. Okay. It isn't to say that terrorism does not pose a destabilizing challenge for great powers, but it's not an existential threat. Okay, that's important, and that's not opinion. Okay, Patricia, did you have your hand up? You're muted.
What about domestic terrorism? I think that's what
Same thing. Domestic terrorism is not an existential threat to the United States. It's scary and it's dangerous, but so is football. No, I'm serious.
I don't know. They don't carry those AK-14s or whatever they're called.
AR-15s?
15s?
Yeah, that's the patriotic weapon of choice, yes.
Oh my God. So I'm
Right, let me ask you a question, okay? In terms of domestic terrorism, how many people have died as a result of domestic terrorism in the last 5 years?
Maybe just a few.
Yeah, if any, depending on how you define it. What I mean by, one second, I'll get to you. Okay, I just want to make sure that you don't think I'm saying something I'm not. All right. You notice I use the term existential threat. That means, okay, it is not a fundamental threat to the continued existence of the United States. And at this point, as pernicious as domestic terrorism can be, it is not that. Now, Emma, I didn't mean to cut you off. I'm sorry.
I was just wondering if shootings were considered domestic terrorism, because quite a few people have died from those in the past 4 years.
Yeah, the problem with that is that most of them really aren't classified as that. And there's a reason for that, which we'll get into in our discussion of terrorism. For something to be considered terrorism, and it's a perfectly legitimate question that Emma's asking, okay? And I'm not saying that we don't have a problem with mass shootings in the United States, particularly compared to other parts of the world. Of course we do. Of course we do. Zachary, the important point is, yes, we had people say they were going to do that. They didn't do it. They couldn't pull it off. I'm not diminishing this and saying it doesn't exist. I'm saying, look, I'm going to say something really coarse here, but it's really important that we keep this in mind. Our leadership is as interchangeable as piston rods in an engine. Okay, I've lived through 3 significant political assassinations, at least, just in my lifetime, of a president, a presidential candidate, and a prominent civil rights leader. All of them within the space of about 5 years. None of those posed an existential threat to the United States. Not one. Not the assassination of Kennedy, not the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, and not the assassination of Martin Luther King. None of those was a fundamental existential threat to the United States. Okay. It's also an open question as to what the political motivations were and whether or not assassination is always an act of terror. Okay, this is the kind of thing we're going to talk about. This is why I teach a course on terrorism at the upper division level if you're interested. And we really work hard at trying to get at what it's kind of at Emma's question, is a mass shooting an act of terror? And the first thing that we talk about in that class is the really incredibly problematic nature of how to define terrorism and have an internationally agreed upon definition of terrorism. Okay. Again, there are all kinds of violent crimes that people commit. Most of them are not for political reasons, okay? I mean, the United States is a fairly violent country, although actual violence in the United States has declined pretty significantly, even from the time that I was your age, okay? And that's, let's say, 40 years, more, 45 years? It's declined significantly. But all you see most of the time on news is when things go south. All you hear about from most of the rest of the world, if you hear anything at all, is when there's violence or a disaster of some kind. Increasingly, that is what the news is violence and disaster. Most of you will go through your entire life without ever having been shot at. Most of you will go through your entire life without ever having been involved in a bomb disposal situation. Now, oddly enough, I have been involved in both of those things, although not directly, right? I've been shot at and I've been in places where there were bombs, okay? I think I'm doing pretty well. It wasn't an existential threat, in that sense. In other words, if I die, it's just no big deal. It's an inconvenience for you because someone has to teach this class, right? But it doesn't mean, oh my God, we are no longer the United States. Why? Because Bill Hughes died. Oh, well, hell. throw in the towel. I mean, what will we do? What hath God wrought? How will we go through a life as Americans if we are Hughesless? But guess what? It's kind of the same thing with a president. It really is. And it's because of the way we've built our institutions, because we've built our institutions to be depersonalized, so that there's the person who inhabits the office, and then there's the office. And in a very real political and economic sense, the only thing that really matters for day-to-day operating business is the integrity of the office. That's why we have a line of succession. Okay, not every country has that. And there are countries that you could fundamentally destabilize by putting a bullet in the brain pan of their leader. You can't do that here. You can't necessarily. Now, nothing's impossible, okay? But this is a test of the endurance of institutions, not of individuals. And that's what people don't understand. A fundamental act of terrorism is not an act against a person. It's an act against stability and order. It's an act against the functional status quo of a nation state. It's an attack on its institutional power structure. That's why 9/11 was an act of terror, right? Because it targeted major political and financial icons or symbols. You know, the World Trade Centers were considered to be appropriate targets because they embodied American capitalism and American commercial globalism. Okay, not because of any of the people who were working there. Okay, the same thing with the Pentagon. The Pentagon is military industrialism. It's a perfect target for a terrorist. But, you know, the United States didn't cease to exist. There's just not a terrorist organization out there that could do that. There isn't. China couldn't do it acting alone. And so, you know, but that's not the narrative you're normally given. The narrative you're normally given is, oh my God, some other, you know, religious fundamentalist or some crazy kid at school or whatever it was did this terrible act of violence. Oh, let's all be afraid. No, let's all be aware is one thing. Okay. So in other words, when you look at a topic like terrorism, okay, the first thing to do is completely separate yourself from the emotionalism of an arguably very emotional subject matter. No one's interested, okay, really, in a professional sense, in whether or not people are scared. What we're interested in is whether or not business can be conducted. That's the crude reality of it, okay? It's inconvenient when people are frightened because they won't go out and shop. You're too young to remember, but one of the most important things that George W. Bush did that really stuck in the front of my mind, and I was waiting for him to do it, and it was, you know, within about 48 hours of the terrorist attacks on 9/11, was to get out and actually tell people to go to a shopping mall. Now, why would you do that? Because it was destroying commerce. That's what this pandemic is freaking everybody out about. You know, most people don't care about the human cost in terms of leadership. They really don't, whatever they tell you. What they're concerned about is this is breaking the back of a complex economy. And if we go back into another lockdown, you know, the economy drops. In the last quarter, we had over 30% economic growth. That's never happened. Okay, there's a reason for that, because we were so deep in a trough that anything like normal business was going to show astronomical growth. Okay, so these issues are much more complicated than just be very afraid. Okay, be very afraid is a lousy analysis. It's not effective and it doesn't help anybody. Okay, so that's the thing to think about with that. And I mean, we can sit here and argue and you can say, well, gee, Hughes, you're being pretty glib about this. No, I'm being pretty professional about it. That's the difference. I am being detached in my analysis because my personal feelings shouldn't matter. Okay, that's the way I want you to approach these things. No one is really interested, except, you know, your personal circle of friends and family, in your personal feelings. Okay, you pollute your own analysis by infusing in that your personal views, your feelings about something. Okay, that's not what we do. That's not what we do. There's a time and a place for that, but academic work, normally speaking, unless you're in a creative writing class or something like that, isn't really that part. That's not what we're doing. Okay, are there any questions about that? It sounds pretty severe, but I'm trying to remind you that, we have a purpose here, and it's not expressing our feelings. Not here. By the way, does anybody have a problem with that? Does anybody think that's unfair or inaccurate? That your feelings should matter in your academic work? And could you explain to me why? That sounds like I'm sort of fronting off on you and daring you to do something and getting all Larry with you. I'm not. I'm genuinely curious why some people think that their personal feelings should matter in their professional work. And as a student, this is essentially your job, right? Let me give you an example. How many of you can think of a specific example where instead of trying to teach you, I just gave you my personal views and said, there, that's the truth. That's what's important. And you knew, what? He has nothing to base this on. This is just his gut feeling. And no, I did not call Vikings savages. Zachary, I don't know where you got that. Certainly not in any serious analytical sense would I ever say anything about that. What I said was that people using the model savage will refer to certain pre-industrial societies or, certain sort of, in quotes, pre-modern societies, and they'll use that term savage. Here's the thing about being in the 21st century. If you are bound and determined to be insulted, right, and to be attacked, you're going to have a good time. Because there's always someone who's going to say something that you can interpret as an attack, as a personal attack on you. It strikes me as extraordinarily self-important to do that. It also strikes me as fundamentally anti-analytical to think that when people say things, they are of necessity targeting you, okay, whoever you are, okay? I don't do that. I don't think it, as my mother used to say, I don't think it's cute, smart, or funny. Okay. So anyway, obviously that wasn't a good example. Do you see my point? In other words, I have feelings. I actually do. I experience things emotionally. It's weird, but I do. I know it's hard to believe. I just don't think it's very important to anybody but me. Okay. What's important, what drags me out of bed in the morning and makes me excited and fun about things is this is interesting stuff, not, oh, I feel so sad about it, or I feel so happy about it, or I feel so angry about it. I don't get angry about this stuff. I don't. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to stop teaching American politics, because these clowns were pissing me off, because they were incompetent idiots who were breaking the republic, who were a greater existential threat to our institutions than anything outside our borders. And I got tired of analyzing it, and telling people the things they didn't want to hear. Right? I didn't feel that I could maintain professionalism. And fortunately, I got the opportunity to do what I really wanted to do, which is this. All right. So again, what I want you to do is think really hard about times when I've just personalized something and left you to think about that. I want you to spend a tremendous amount of time wasted on that. But when you stop wasting your time on that, what I'd like you to think about is, okay, of those 5 things that he's listed in module 5, what's my first choice? What's the thing that I really, either that I think I already know something about, or more importantly, that I really want to learn more about? What's the next most important thing that I would be willing to do? And then if I had to do another one, without being sort of totally disgusted, what would it be? And then shoot me an email. And again, it's going to be first come, first serve. And the first, like the first 4 or 5 people who come in and say, I want to do climate change. Oh, boom, you got climate change. Okay. All right. Are there any questions on that? I just wanted to get ahead of the game a little bit. So the deal is, if we can finish those in that week between November 30th and Wednesday the 2nd, in those 2 classes, right? If we can do that, then we don't have to meet on the 7th or the 9th of the following week. Isn't that Monday? Would it be the? Sorry. Yeah, we don't have to. And then what I'll do is I'll schedule essentially an office hour period during those times, so that if someone wants to review with me or something like that, you can do that. But this last assignment, remember, you're only going to have to be responsible for one of those readings. Yeah, Kennedy.
So that would be the last assignment. There wouldn't be like a final for this class or anything.
No, finals are no fun. Finals are fake. Fake news. No, you can't choose a topic from module 4. No, got to be one of those. Just because I want to make sure that everybody's kind of on the same page and I don't want people going backwards.
I think I misheard for a second. You just said that this last assignment, so us doing the whole thing with the topics, that's our last assignment?
Yeah.
Okay.
We're going to have an assignment for this Sunday, right? Which I haven't posted yet, and I'm not going to post until Wednesday. We're going to have an assignment for module 4. It's going to be pretty simple. I can tell pretty much I'm going to have you take any two of those models and contrast them. Okay. So what I would do if I were you and I were looking at those models, the 5 different models, I would be thinking, okay, a couple of the, like I was trying to read world systems and it didn't make sense. Good, leave it out. And say, what I'll do is I'm going to contrast geopolitical realism with liberal internationalism and really focus on those. Then that kind of obviates the need for you to go any deeper into the other ones. Does that make sense? So I'll post that assignment by Wednesday. But I want to, again, as I've said before, I don't like people kind of studying too much to the assignment instead of just immersing themselves in the material. Okay, so we'll have that assignment. And then during that week of the 7th through I think it's the 7th through the 11th, something like that, isn't it? Yeah, 7th through the 11th. At some point in there, agreed upon by the group, we'll have your last assignment, but it will not be a final. There is no cumulative final exam in here. We just covered too much material. I don't think that would be fair. You know, I don't know. Unless you want one. I mean, I'm more than happy to, you know, write a really hard cumulative final. Minimum 20 pages. You know, I had a class like that once. I learned a lot and I hated it. All right. Okay, so any other questions then on kind of where we are in the class so far before we go into our last 2 models here, liberal internationalism and idealism? Anything else? Questions or concerns? Okay. What is liberal internationalism?
From the article, at least, it was talking about how just like globally, it's a focus on more like human rights and whatnot. And then things being like, I don't know, countries being more democratic and whatnot.
Yes, that's correct. As far as it goes, that is perfectly correct. What would be the value of there being more republics, more democratic political arrangements in terms of order, according to liberal internationalists?
Could I continue on it, or do you want?
Oh, I'm
else?
sorry. Did I interrupt you?
No, you didn't. No.
Okay, yeah, no, go ahead. Sure.
Okay, just to answer that, but the idea was if people had more say in like their country and whatnot, then it would then lead to less wars and whatnot.
Why would that be the case?
I wish I could remember.
It's really simple. It's really simple. It's really simple. Simpler than you think.
Well, because the people wars are not popular.
No, because wars are not
yeah.
popular. Because people don't like war. You know, I mean, you know, it's funny with all the posturing of America and the hyper machismo and all that kind of stuff. We are not warlike people. I mean, yeah, we'll shoot each other over a parking lot, but that's just because we're patriots. But we do not want to go out there and kill other people. We don't like it. We find it inconvenient, if nothing else. The theory of liberal internationalism is exactly what Kennedy suggested. It is the idea that, first of all, that there's a range. I love that. I love when cats get in the way. But not in the way, when cats become part of the conversation. That there is an assumption in liberal internationalism that there's a better way to do things. And that the kind of really brutal, relentless contestation of realism is a way to do things, but A, it's not the only way, B, it's not the best way. It's not inevitable that the international environment remains lawless, chaotic, and violent. Okay, and that if we democratize, then what we're and we listen to, through those democratic institutions, we listen to the aggregate will of the people, there will simply be fewer nation states going to war. Okay. Now, here's the thing. Remember when I said that in the theory of realism, one of the assumptions is that realism doesn't look at internal political factors. It just looks at, remember that term, the state is a unitary rational actor. Okay? That's realism. Okay. And the assumption of realism is that states acting as these unitary actors, they make their decisions on the basis of a really kind of Machiavellian rationality. What do I have to do just to survive? Not what's the right thing to do, but what is the right thing to do so that I can survive or advance power? In other words, what's the right thing to do so that I can win? Okay? In liberal internationalism, what's the rational actor? Do we abandon the assumption of realism and say, no, the state is not the rational actor. There's some other rational actor. Does it make sense what I'm asking? Who's the one taking, what is the thing taking action in liberal internationalism? Is it not the state?
Would it be the people?
But in other words, if we wanted to take action in terms of foreign policy, how could we possibly do that? Do we control the military? Do we make law? Who makes law? Who controls the military?
The government.
The state.
State.
Yeah. No, that's, yeah, government, state. So the idea is, and the reason I'm leaning into this a little bit, because I think a couple of you are aware of this, it's not really clear in this article. This article, by the way, written by a student. That's one of the reasons I included it. Now, this is a master's degree student who's probably, I'm guessing, a couple of years older than some of you. So this too can be yours. This is pretty solid writing. But one of the things that could be clearer, I think, is the idea that, yes, there's still a unitary rational actor. What's different, one way to think about this as distinct from realism, boy, that sounds like a real hint for how to do the assignment, would be the rationality is not based on winning competition. The rational guidance is derived from the will of the people. So Kennedy, you were almost right, okay? The actor isn't the people. The rational governance is exercised by the people through these Republican institutions, small r, Republican, representative institutions, right? So the degree to which the state is responsive to the people in promulgating its foreign policy, right, is the degree to which it is a liberal internationalist state. And the theory then is, exactly as Kennedy suggested, the more nation states out there go democratic and have like these popular free and fair elections and all this kind of stuff, the less contestation there will be, because the people don't want to fight. They want to put their kids in school, and they want their kids to have food, and they want their businesses to work, and they want their personal relationships to be happy and all this stuff, but they don't want to go out and have constant war. They don't care about winning against the French or the Chinese or anything else. In other words, we have to be revved up to do that. That is, we have to be compelled to act in a way that is arguably irrational, because it's not necessarily in our best interests from the point of view of liberal internationalism. The thing about liberalism that's important to remember here is that liberalism as a theory kind of presupposes that human beings are in a constant, first of all, we're in a constant sort of voyage of discovery. That part of liberalism is this idea of scientific skepticism. That is, there's always more to learn. Why? Because we can always improve the human condition. Now that's important, because realism doesn't assume that. Realism says, look, you got to make the deal where you are, because that's the human condition. You don't fix the human condition, you deal with it. Liberal internationalism says, no, we can improve the conditions within which human beings live, and therefore we can improve the human species by simply improving their conditions. You change the environment, you change the individual. That's a liberal assumption, okay? In the sense that we're talking about with international relations and political philosophy. Liberalism is about the ultimate perfectibility of the species. We can do better. We can do better. We can, in fact, have perpetual peace instead of perpetual war. That's a very liberal internationalist assumption. Does that make sense? Okay. Do you think it's true? If you had to compare, say, realism, you may not like it, but if you had to look at the world as a realist and look at the world as a liberal internationalist, which one do you think tells us a more helpful story? Which one seems to work best as a theory to explain things? Okay, liberal internationalism. Okay, what is the advantage of liberal internationalism over realism in terms of its explanatory power?
I think at least for the explanatory power, it's more of like, I don't know, kind of open-ended if you're explaining it to somebody. So then, like, I don't know, there's a bit more positivity to, I don't know if that's the right
No,
word.
that's fine. In other words, would you say that the important component of, sorry, go ahead. I stepped on you.
That's all good.
I hate
Because
this delay.
as for realism, then it's just kind of like closed off, like you're in this box and you're not getting out of it.
Well, you're not getting out of it without a fight.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So would you say that liberal internationalism has the virtue of being more optimistic? Is optimism always true? Cassidy says emphatically no, even with a muted microphone. Are you high? You know, human beings are scum.
I mean, I don't know. I was just thinking like this might be a poor example, but my dad is an eternal optimist. And every time like his expectations for everything are super, super high and it just cannot be met. And so a lot of the times I'm like, okay, is optimism really as good of like, you know, a thing to be wary about?
That's a perfectly legitimate question, especially if what you're trying to explain is like, suppose you're trying to explain the civil war in Yemen. What does a liberal internationalist have to say about that? I mean, people are butchering each other on all sides. And you have Saudi Arabia fueling this fire with billions of dollars in military hardware, largely provided by the United States, which is offering logistical support to one side. The Houthi are being arguably supported by Iran, but they're not lackeys of Iran. I mean, this looks like something you could fuel this thing, and you know, hundreds of thousands of people have died. More are going to die. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of room for optimism, but liberal internationalism would insist, no, there's a better way to do this. So I don't know how many of you are aware of what is right now the #1 human rights catastrophe on the planet, arguably, is this war in Yemen. Okay. But the question would be, the challenge for a liberal internationalist, other than just being a sort of myopic optimist who's always being disappointed, would be, well, tell me a better way to resolve this than just firepower. The first thing a liberal internationalist would say, arguably, is the parties involved here, the vast majority of them, the vast majority of people who are losing their lives and their homes to this catastrophe don't want any part of it. They don't want to fight. They have been pushed into this by a leadership that wants to gain by struggle. This is what happened in the breakup of Yugoslavia, right? You had people who had been living together more or less harmoniously for about a millennium. But when it's funny, not funny, it's weird. When Yugoslavia blew up after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the death of Tito, more importantly, right? You kept hearing this narrative again and again and again in mainstream media. Well, they've been at war for over 1,000 years. The problem with that was it's totally false, because under Tito, they'd had this kind of liberal socialist regime that wasn't the Soviet Union and was remarkably sovereign from the Soviet Union. And you had people from different ethnicities and different religions and everything. It wasn't like everything was perfect, but everything's not perfect in the United States. But I don't think anybody would say that we're in a constant state of war within this country. That would be nonsense, okay? But the problem was that there were fractions within Yugoslav leadership who thought, we can seize this territory. We can seize power here. We can become leaders of a breakaway territory here. They thought like realists. They weren't thinking about, what was right for the people. They weren't responding to democratic impulses. They were warping them, okay? This is what almost always happens in war. It isn't that there's a mass uprising of people, let's go put a boot up their ass. It's more like we're told, well, they've done these terrible things, even if they haven't, doesn't matter. They've done these terrible things and they're coming for you, and they're coming, for your sister. It's always usually that kind of sexist kind of stuff, or they're coming for your children, or they're coming for your business, or whether they are the Japanese in World War II, or they were, the Germans in World War I, or they were communists in the Cold War, whatever it was. There's this mythologizing of this absolute enemy that is implacable, unstoppable, inhumane, okay? If you buy into that, then you'll go kill it, because it's like stepping on a spider, even though I don't like doing that, right? I'm one of those weird guys who, if there's a black widow, I will catch it and put it outside, and people think I'm insane. I just don't feel right stepping on it, man. It's not their fault, But this is what a liberal internationalist would say is, no, this is a failure of leadership. This isn't a failure of the people. Leaders need to listen to their people. Had they listened to their people, they would have been restrained by those people, instead of trying to push those people into violent, uncompromising mayhem, which is what they did, okay? So you see how it's, again, in its extreme, it's just optimistic. But you see how there's a kind of pragmatism that can be situated within liberal internationalism. Where did things break down in the liberal internationalist model? When you stopped listening to the people. When you arrogated to yourselves as this little cabal of power aspirants. You know how we could get more power? We could go kill these people over here. We could destroy them. Well, we don't have people who want to do that. That's okay. Leave it to me. I give you Nazi Germany. Germany didn't, the German people did not want to go out and exterminate the rest of the world. They really didn't. Either did the Japanese people. They were taken over by fascist regimes. And the premise of fascism is better living through violence. So do you see how it's illiberal? Fascism is illiberal. It's anti-liberal. And that's what happened, because in Weimar Germany and in sort of pre-fascist Japan, the ascendant force there was liberalism, liberal internationalism. Okay. Now, Japan, had wavered at that time, because there were always these aspirants to empire. You often find that when you have aspirants to great power who are in relatively small territories. They're always looking to expand because they need resources. Okay, and for Japan, obviously, that was into the Pacific, into the possessions that were held by the Dutch and things like that, because they needed rubber, they needed oil, they needed the engine of empire to be fueled with all these resources, right? And that became co-opted by this fascist militarist leadership that wasn't listening to the people at all. Okay, in other words, do you see what I'm saying? This is how a liberal internationalist would explain the Second World War. Okay, a realist would say, it's just a clash of great powers. This happens. Get over it. This is the world. Learn to survive in it. Make an alliance and stop the Axis. Who do you make an alliance with? The Soviet Union. Well, what about the Red Scare? Who cares? But you've convinced the American people that communism is a disease they can catch on toilet seats. How can we then make common cause with them? Because we're killing fascism. Oh, okay. That's what we did. That's exactly what we did. Remember those things we were telling you about communism and organized labor and all that? Oh, could you just, we'll get back to that. Put a pin in that. Let's go kill some Germans and Japanese and Italians. The odd Italian and Vichy French, right? Because they're fascists, and that's a bad thing. We fought that war ostensibly against fascism. We fought that war to advance liberalism, but not because we were idealistic about it or because we really believed that we were necessarily improving the world. We did it so we could continue to control the global economy. We did it so that we could make common cause with Western Europe by stabilizing it, getting these dissident elements out of there that were destabilizing Europe and making business lousy for everybody. That would be a realist. You see how those explanations are very different, right? The one involves these kinds of more or less optimistic notions about human nature. Left to our own devices, we're not violent people. There will be violent people among us, but that doesn't make us violent people. Only when we surrender to the will of violent people do we behave violently. Most of us just want to get along. We just want to live our lives. We don't want to fight with people in our personal lives, and we don't want to go to war with people in our public lives. That would be liberal internationalism. Realism is like, who cares? They'll do what we tell them to do because we know what's going on and they don't. And they know they don't, and they're waiting to be led. That's classic Machiavelli. If you take Political Science 201, which I'm not recommending, but saying, if you take Political Science 201, which I'm teaching right now on Tuesdays and Thursdays, we recently finished a unit on Machiavelli. One of the things that Machiavelli says is, look, the only thing that people want, and this is pre-democracy, the only thing that people want is not to be oppressed. As long as you don't oppress them, they're fine. That's realism. So if you can convince us there's an evil out there waiting for us, let's go kill it before it comes and gets us. And you can convince people that that's real, then and only then will they pick up a weapon and fight. I mean, that's really history. It doesn't mean that we don't have ethnic strife and things like that, but it's like the argument that religion causes war. People struggling for power cause war. Religion can be used to mobilize people to go fight. But simple differences in religion alone do not cause war. They cause people not to speak to each other at the same dinner table, but that's not war. That's just not getting along, right? That would be a liberal internationalist. It'd be like, look, I understand that we have these different religions but we're, above and beyond that, we have a shared humanity. We have a shared sense of ourselves as human beings. Let's be humane to each other. Let's follow our natural inclination to be rational and reasonable and humane, and let's tolerate our differences. That is liberal internationalism. Okay? Realism is like, screw that, I'm crushing you. Why? Because I can. That would be an extreme way of comparing those. Okay, questions about that? Anything there that you think, I'm not really comfortable with this, it doesn't make sense to me, or why would someone want to do that, or whatever? You look at American foreign policy. Which of those models that we've looked at, sorry, my system is slow here. Realism, world systems, clash of civilizations, liberal internationalism, which one sounds to you more like the United States? Your country, for the most part, right? Or at least the place where you're living right now. What do you think? That is, by the way, not an easy question. Okay, so Patricia says liberalism. If it's liberalism, why have we spent so much of our history supporting brutal dictators? Which we have done. What do you think? Come on. Our best interest. Yeah, but see, notions of our best interest as an individual nation state sounds more like realism, not liberalism, not liberal internationalism. What do you think?
I feel like it would be realism.
Realism? What do you think would have to change if your assumption, at least the implicit assumption of the group here, is accurate, and the United States might best be described in terms of its foreign policy as geopolitical realism? What would have to change for us to be less geopolitical realist and more, let's say, liberal internationalist? What would have to be different? What would have to change? Cassidy, did you have your hand up?
I just have a question that's not super related to that, but
It's okay.
along
We'll
the
come back
same
to
vein.
it. We'll come back to it.
Do we have to be just one? Or can we be like, oh, I want to,
Well, that's
I
kind of
see
where I'm
liberalism
going.
and realism and see this kind of like ebb and flow and knitting together of all of them. based
Well,
on
that's what I meant.
whatever
That's
they're-
kind of where I'm going. You're ahead of me a little bit. So what
Sorry.
you're suggesting is, wait a minute, we shouldn't speak of this in absolutist terms. It's not like an either or. Maybe it's like in some situations we can be liberal internationalist. In other situations we are compelled, to be realists. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah. I mean, and
Okay.
I feel like oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm agreeing. We're just on a delay here.
Mhm.
So how would we do it? When do we know, okay, this is one where we got to be realists. On this one, we can afford the luxury of optimism. We can be liberal internationalists. You're muted your mic. Oh, I'm not going to let you off that easy. You have to do this now.
I don't know. I think it depends like person to person. And I don't know if that's me like bringing, people as like an individual too much into play.
If it's
This is
person to
like-
person, then none of those theories applies.
That's fair.
Yeah. And I'm not exactly sure that that's what you meant. What about from
Yeah.
administration to administration? Because
Yeah,
ultimately,
That
isn't
makes
it
sense.
not the individual in the White House, but the administration surrounding that individual as the executive branch that makes foreign policy?
Mhm.
So would you say that there have been times when we've had presidents who might be more realist, hard-edged, kind of Cold Warrior, whatever, and other times when we've had presidents who've tried to be more liberal internationalists in terms of the way they act as commander-in-chief, the way they act as chief diplomat, using the State Department, using the notions of what are called hard and soft power? Like hard power would be the military, soft power would be economic influence, cultural influence, things like that. That a liberal internationalist might say, rather than rattle the saber and threaten these people, why don't we provide them with a better example? Do you see how that would be liberal internationalism?
Mhm.
Well, hasn't there been a lot of that kind of symbolism at least in US foreign policy? Ronald Reagan often would invoke this notion of the United States being a city on a hill. It's sort of quasi-biblical. The idea being we will be an example to the rest of the world of the right way to do things. That sounds like liberal internationalism more than it does realism. Even though most people associate the 8 years of Reagan with pretty brutal realism in terms of foreign policy. What would be an example of the United States behaving in a way where you think, no, that right there that we did there, that was liberal internationalism on balance, if it had to be one or the other?
We went and brokered the peace in the Russo-Japanese War.
How would a realist explain that though, Tristan?
I mean, I guess it served to our best interests in creating peace in there, and then Japan
really
as
did.
a trade thing. But yeah, I guess.
But I'm not arguing against you at all. What I'm trying to do is build on Cassidy's idea that simultaneously you might serve both kinds of interests. If you are brokering a peace, for example, what you're essentially saying is, look, no one wants to fight anymore. Let's not do this anymore. But you could be gaining an advantage in terms of you're enhancing what's called your soft power. If you can broker a meaningful, enduring peace agreement, you have just become more powerful. Okay. So you could simultaneously be motivated by both liberal internationalist and realist ideas, or the team that goes to negotiate that peace. And Tristan, I would suggest that the team of people who negotiated that peace were a combination of realists and idealists, in the sense that they were at least liberals, if not idealists. We haven't even got to idealism yet. So that's an interesting example, because brokering a peace sounds like liberal internationalism. Because remember, the fundamental aim of liberal internationalism is not prevailing in war, it's preventing it. To the extent that you are preventing war and you are motivated by that as your fundamental predicate of your existence and your policy, that would be more liberal internationalism. Tristan, that's a great example, though. It's the kind of thing that my son is an Asian historian, and he has schooled me a lot on that particular case. But I would suggest that this feeds into Cassidy's idea of multiple motives in a complex process of engaging with the rest of the world. It is very seldom the case that a single country, even within a single period of time, can simply be dismissed as either realist or anything else, realist or not. You could also bring world systems theory into this. You could argue that those were clashes of great empires. Great empires are struggling over control of world capitalism. That would be the Leninist notion of things, okay? So you could even bring world systems theory into that. The point here is, okay, looked at with an open mind, there are compelling elements of any of these theories. I would suggest, and maybe Cassidy, this is what you were trying to say, and I just am now just getting it. No one of them is a perfect explanation. Is that fair?
Yeah, I would say so.
Okay, because remember, they're theories, right? They're alternative explanations. And when Tristan points out, the brokering of a peace agreement, especially a really problematic one with lots of moving parts, okay, that really requires something other than simply a kind of confrontational realism. It requires you to kind of put the weapons away and bring out the pens and paper and begin to negotiate. As soon as you cease hostilities, even if you're ultimately motivated by advancing your own power, which is realism, you can also be motivated, and I think this was Cassidy's suggestion, you can also be motivated by the desire to prevent more destabilization, more harm, more violence, more destruction, which is more like, and you may believe you can do it. Woodrow Wilson saying, after promising when he was campaigning for the presidency that we would not engage in World War I, with knowing that he had every intention of doing so, right? Then says, we need to fight this war. This is a war to end all wars. This is a war to make the world safe for democracy. That's liberal internationalism. In other words, you're dragged reluctantly into war because of your greater value of the future being warless. That's the ultimate in liberal internationalism, okay? Now, what about the last one? This is the most problematic, idealism. Did any of you have a chance yet to read that little blurb on idealism? It's really short, but I guarantee you it doesn't help much. What's the problem with idealism, at least according to this?
It did say how there's no set explanation or definition of it.
Yeah, there isn't an agreed upon definition of what idealism is. In fact, you heard me make an interesting slip about 5 minutes ago when I was saying liberal internationalism, and I said idealism. Because for some theorists, idealism is essentially what informs liberal internationalism. It's not, in other words, it's not a separate and distinct theory. It's incorrect to suggest that it's a distinct theory as apart from liberal internationalism. Okay. And so obviously, I think you would have trouble on the assignment, for example. I'm doing exactly what I tell you not to do. I'm lecturing to the assignment. But, you wouldn't necessarily want to try to contrast idealism and liberal internationalism. From this point of view, one of the things that Peter Wilson seems to be saying is the one is kind of informing the other. You could even argue that there's not a hard and fast distinction between idealism and any of the other things. It depends on what your ideals are. The problem with idealism, it depends on what you value, doesn't it? This gets us back to our arguments about culture. If your culture is premised on the idea of having superiority in some way, and that is an ideal, okay, then it's really hard to argue that a policy that would undermine your superiority, even to save people's lives, would really satisfy your ideals. This is why idealism as a concept is really imperfect in trying to explain foreign policy. This is what Wilson is arguing. It doesn't really help us understand anything standing alone. It has to be linked to something else, okay? And so that when you read that, and again, if you just read that first long paragraph and you could read the one on general overviews as well if you want, it just gives some examples of different thinkers in idealism. The main thing I want you to keep in mind there is that in some international relations classes, you will be taught as a separate unit something called, foreign policy idealism. What Wilson is saying, and what seems to make sense, I think it's a compelling argument, is idealism as a concept really works better when you link it into one of those other theories, particularly liberal internationalism. And so for our purposes moving forward, I would accept that. If you, say you decided, well, is the clash of civilizations different from liberal internationalism? One of the things you might argue is, yeah, it kind of is, because the clash of civilizations assumes a kind of pluralism, much of which is anti-democratic. The clash of civilizations model presumes there are going to be different cultures that resist democracy, that are impenetrable to democracy absent war, absent clash, okay? That sounds more like realism. So, you could make a compelling argument of how liberal internationalism and the clash of civilizations model are incompatible, because the clash of civilizations is just a different way of conceptualizing realism. What would be the difference between the clash of civilizations and sort of pure realism theory? Remember, the state is a unitary rational actor in realism. Does that hold true for the clash of civilizations? I realize you're still reading these materials, so what I'm trying to suggest is these are things to think about. Because these civilizations transcend individual nation states. That's an important thing to remember. The assumption is, when you look at the clash of civilizations discussion, there are these basic cultures within which nation states share common values and aspirations. There's the Western Orthodox, Islamic, Buddhist. I actually have to look this down because I often forget it. Hindu, maybe African, Latin American, Sinic, and Japanese. Okay, has an idealism been how America justified things like that? Yes. Zachary, you got ahead of me on the next thing I wanted to do. Good call. One of the ways that idealism can actually help you pursue realism, right, is it gives you a way of framing an inevitable conflict that you see as inevitable in moral terms by invoking idealism or liberal internationalism and saying, the example that Zachary provided was Vietnam. Well, there was no moral reason for us to intervene in Vietnam. We did not. It's really almost inconceivable to argue that we did that for the good of the people of Vietnam. Okay. But we presented that to the American people such that I remember actually as a 10-year-old kid writing it. Now, come on, I was 10, all right? I've evolved a little since 10, even though I'm still the same little kid with a big head, okay? And I remember writing a paper that sounded a lot like what my father might have written about the Second World War, or let's say the First World War as a little kid, Yeah, because when he was 10, he was born in 24, so when he was 10, that would have been 34. Yeah. And I remember saying, we have to fight in Vietnam or we will have to fight in the United States. I actually said, I don't want to end up speaking Vietnamese. Now, that was me as a 9 or 10-year-old kid. That's propaganda. Because there was no way that Hanoi was going to send, planes over here with, secret, communist Vietnamese people, in the NVA or the Viet Cong to, infiltrate us and teach us, Vietnamese at gunpoint. It shows you that that's thinking like a child. What I'm suggesting is there were adults saying the same thing. You know how I know? Because that's where I learned it. I learned it from school teachers telling me, if we don't fight them there, we will have to fight them here. See how they make it into a moral argument. We don't want to do this. They're making us do it. We know that war is bad, but we've got to fight for the things that we know are good, and they're coming for us. That's the way Vietnam, when I was a little kid, that's the way it was presented to us. And then some of us, because if you're a blue collar kid or a little above that, your uncles and big brothers and stuff like that are going to war, and you're seeing them come back, and you're thinking there's something really wrong going on here. This is not right. Something's wrong. And then all of a sudden, you realize what Patricia pointed out earlier. This isn't our war. This is a proxy war. This is us fighting the Soviet Union by stirring up trouble in Southeast Asia. That's what we're doing. That doesn't sound very moral. You know what it sounds like, though? Realism. So you see how these theories are not completely, there you go. Okay. Yeah. I mean, it is geopolitical realism, but it's sort of dressed up like for the prom. It looks very much like idealism or liberal internet. We're trying to fix the world. It's got this problem. What's the problem? The domino theory and communism. And because, communists, like they put their pants on backwards. They do all these things that we don't want our kids to do. They're wrong. They wear cardboard. It's terrible. They live wretched, crummy lives. They're slave states. We use those terms all through the Cold War, And the idea is we created, through a kind of domestic propaganda, a moral argument for something that was arguably morally indefensible. Okay? Again, I'm inhabiting the mindset of a liberal internationalist. No, you took our theory, you took our ideas, our idealism, and our notion of human perfectibility, and you corrupted them to convince a bunch of 18-year-old Americans to go over and kill people in Southeast Asia and come back broken. That's a terrible thing to do. That kind of argument. That would be a liberal internationalist or an idealist. A realist would say, look, you got to break a few eggs, man, to make a geopolitical omelet. This, war happens. Do you see the difference? Well, in fact, what I would suggest is there really are only two theories looked at from this point of view. One of them is realism. The other one is some variant of liberalism. That, world systems theory is economic geopolitical realism. It really is. Oh no, there's nothing more important than preserving global capitalism. And it's not a system that will survive on its own. It's a system that will only survive if it's supported by powerful nation states. Because, people are not organically capitalists. I mean, we might as well we could very well be organically socialist. Who knows? I mean, we are a cooperative species. Otherwise, we wouldn't have survived as a species. That doesn't sound like cutthroat capitalism. That doesn't sound like core and periphery. That sounds like people just trying to survive. It's a little different model. So you can get into these really deep philosophical or theoretical or ideological arguments. Or you can say, well, it's kind of realism and everything else. In terms of foreign policy, and again, I don't know if any of you have ever had like relatives or anybody who's worked in the State Department or anybody like that. Because of what I do for a living, I've known a lot of people who were in the State Department and went to graduate school with a guy who everyone was saying had been in the State Department. And I said, he wasn't at State, he's a spook. And I remember I sat at a bar one time after about 12 beers. The guy was a spook. He was an absolute spook. He was mentioned in a book. And I tracked the guy down. I said, this is you, isn't it? He's like, yeah, don't tell anybody. Well, you're in a book, man. He was a CIA guy. But he did something we're not supposed to do, right? He would go to different countries nominally as an employee of the State Department, not admitting, oh no, I'm an agent of the United States government. I'm not representing it. I'm spying on you. Okay. I mean, see, it all gets very blurred. But one of the things that you realize when you talk to people who work in the Foreign Service, and it's a fascinating gig, right? You're constantly being pulled one way or the other by the realists and the idealists in the Foreign Service. And the Foreign Service idealists are the people who are kind of liberal internationalists. It's really important for us to make these friendships and make these cultural overtures to people and use what's called soft power, because we can actually, not only can we demonstrate where we're doing things that might compel people to want to be like us, but we might even be able to learn from them, right? That's all soft power exchanges, and it's non-confrontational. All right. But you're also going to have realists who are saying, look, you know, these people are inferior to us, or they're inevitable adversaries of ours, or whatever they are, right? We have to have a consulate here. We have to have an embassy here. We don't have to love these people. Okay. We just have to make sure they don't pull any shit with us. That's a realist. And that is the Department of State. Let's see, would you call all of America's attempted and successful coups in South America American realism? Well, no, more importantly, it's not what I would call it. Would realism explain those? I think maybe, Zachary, is what you're asking. Yes, because obviously liberal internationalism can't. But if you're organizing coups against duly elected governments, if you look at, I mean, the one I remember no one could explain to me as a little kid was in 1964. I didn't understand why, you know, we were accelerating our involvement in Vietnam. The next thing I knew, Lyndon Johnson sent troops down to the Dominican Republic. And I knew, you know, I'm almost embarrassed to admit that I knew where the Dominican Republic was because I was a baseball fan. And the Giants had a lot of Dominican ball players, San Francisco Giants. So I knew where the Dominican Republic is. And I'm like, Dad, you know, why are we going there? Because that's where Felipe Alou is from. You know, why are we invading them? Well, we're not invading them, Willie. Well, what are we doing? Well, you see, they got some people in there with some bad ideas. You know, my dad actually sounded kind of like Richard Nixon when he was explaining foreign policy. And no, we went down there and crushed a legitimately elected government because we thought they were too socialist. Now, that's a violation of international law. Completely. It's indefensible. Right. And we said we were liberating them to save democracy, as Zachary said. Yes, that's exactly what I was told. That's exactly what we were told as the American people. And by the way, for the most part, that's the way the mainstream media played it. That's a whole other thing we can get into. I mean, it's why I teach the media class, is because it's like, where do Americans get their ideas about the rest of the world? From the media. Because most of us aren't well traveled, you know. All right, so what I want you to think about then, you know, we have covered a lot of ground here, but what I'm trying to suggest is that, I mean, some of the comments that Zachary just posted here kind of illustrate this, how you can use the language of liberalism, of saving the world, making the world safe for democracy, or fighting a war to end all wars, or, you know, fighting godless. Every time you describe communism as godless, what you're essentially saying is, if it ain't got God in it, it's evil, you know. Well, okay, I don't get it, but okay. But you're doing that. Well, what you're really doing as a policy is geopolitical realism. It's just that you can use the language and symbols. Jimmy Carter used the language and symbols of geopolitical realism, okay? But ultimately, even under Carter, who was as benevolent a president as we may ever have had in terms of foreign policy, we didn't cease to function as a kind of realist power. We attenuated that quite a bit. He did negotiate a lot of peace treaties. He did try to kind of make U.S. foreign policy more humane and more idealistic and more liberal in the small L sense of it. By the way, this has nothing to do necessarily with being left-wing or right-wing necessarily, okay? It has to do with the idea of the assumption of whether or not we can exercise soft power or hard power. Carter was in an interesting situation in his 4 years as president. He had a Secretary of State, Cyrus Vance, who was essentially a liberal internationalist, what is sometimes called a regionalist. As the Secretary of State, he really strengthened or tried to strengthen the power of the regional elements within the State Department. You know, the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, whatever it was, give them more autonomy, give the culturalists and the liberal internationalists within those regional organizations of state, give them more influence over foreign policy, rather than what Zbigniew Brzezinski did, right? He was the national security advisor. He was a student of Henry Kissinger, and he was a brutal geopolitical realist. Brutal, I mean, not he was a brutal man, but he was brutal in the sense that the world is a terrible place with terrible people. Communism is terrible. And why not? He came from Poland, under communism, right? And so, these are people who had living memory of the Nazis and the worst of the Stalinist purges and things like that. And so to them, the world was about realism. It was about us and them. It was about conflict. So the Carter administration actually had these two really prominent forces within it in terms of foreign policy. Cyrus Vance was largely a kind of geopolitical liberal, and Brzezinski was a realist, okay? And that was within the same administration. And obviously it led to a lot of chaos and might well be one of the reasons why the Iran hostage crisis came down the way it did, because they couldn't resolve that. Jimmy Carter was pulling human intelligence out of Iran. There was a thing called the Church Commission in 1975 that found out all these abuses that American CIA operatives were doing in different countries, and that we had assassination manuals and all this kind of stuff that, was prohibited under United States law, right? They tried to fix all that. What it involved was taking out a lot of human intelligence, so that in September, right before the Iran hostage crisis, Jimmy Carter makes a public speech in which he talks about what a great ally the Shah of Iran is. That's a disaster. It's because he wasn't getting the intelligence he needed. So this is what happens with foreign policy, is you're always balancing the aspirations of the idealists within your regime who are trying to pursue this kind of liberal internationalist policy of using soft power and diplomacy and negotiation. And then you have what are called the hardliners. Those would be the realists. Okay? Does any of this make sense? What I'm trying to do is give you a sense that, when you study international studies as a major, a lot of what you get is about, we're fighting to save, the second language requirement, a lot of sort of cultural elements of this. But there's always this notion of the struggle of power, and whether that struggle of power is how to preserve order and security, or whether it's about just crushing your enemies and fighting proxy wars and doing all this other stuff. That is an inescapable component of history. Okay, so part of international studies is, well, what are the different ways that people have gone about the business of trying to explain this to us? And which ones sound plausible? What you ultimately may well discover is something like what a combination of Kennedy and Cassidy have pointed out, which is you kind of have to know how to use them all, because there's going to be some slack in there between absolute theories. No human action is completely explained by any one theory. It's almost always multiple complex variables, okay? So I want you to go ahead and read through those. What we're going to do is on Wednesday, we're going to have a review of these. I'll take questions and things like that. Could be a relatively short class. Then I will give you the assignment. I'll post the assignment, and having it due by Sunday gives you enough time, yeah? That seems to have worked pretty well. Yeah, so you'll have an assignment that will be posted. It's written, it's sitting there, but it's invisible. You can't see it. Only I can. And then you'll have that, and then we'll move on to that last module 5. So 2 things to do. Finish reading the module 4 readings on global terms of order, and then send me an email and tell me which of the subjects in module 5 is your first, second, or third preference for kind of leading a discussion, and then ultimately being able to write about that in your last assignment. Okay, any questions? Covered a lot of material today. Okay? All right then, I will see you, presumably I will see all of you on Wednesday for a brief review, and by then I should know who's going to be presenting what. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.